I want to see peace. Look, you know why I want? Because I don't want all these people killed anymore. I'm looking at people that are being killed, and they're Russian and Ukrainian people, but they're people. Doesn't matter where they're from on the whole planet. And I think I have the power to end this war. And I think it's going very well.
President Donald Trump pushes back on Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky following backlash over peace talks between the United States and Russia. And Donald Trump decided to drop a nuke while he was talking about this issue. Remember, Trump is willing to have diplomatic talks without inviting Ukraine. Zelensky doesn't like it. He spoke out against it. Here's how Trump responds.
For 3 years, you should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal.
You should have never started it, implying that Ukraine, rather than Russia under Putin's leadership, started that war. Of course, that's not true. Of course, Russia invaded Ukraine during the Biden administration in February of 2022. But look, that video that you just watched has now sparked major tit-for-tat verbal war between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine. Trump is actually now going so far as to refer to Zelensky as a dictator. And we're gonna give you the details on that in just a moment. But before we get to that, here's how Zelensky responded to Trump's statements from his press conference at Mar-a-Lago yesterday, including this whole notion that Ukraine never should have started a war that Russia actually started. Let's take a look.
We have seen this disinformation. We understand that it is coming from Russia. We understand and we have evidence that these numbers are being discussed between America and Russia. It is unfortunate that President Trump, and with great respect for him as the leader of the American people who constantly support us, unfortunately lives in this disinformation space.
So there you have Zelensky accusing Donald Trump of living in a disinformation space, that he's essentially regurgitating some of the disinformation that is specifically sourced from the Kremlin, from Vladimir Putin and Russia. And as you can imagine, Donald Trump did not take kindly to that line at all. In fact, he decided to escalate their spat through a social media post on Truth Social, of course, where he called the Ukrainian president a modestly successful comedian before calling him a dictator. Let's give you his statement verbatim. He says, Zelensky refuses to have elections, is very low in Ukrainian polls, and the only thing he was good at was playing Biden like a fiddle. A dictator without elections, Zelensky better move fast or he is not going to have a country left. Now, as you can imagine, there are a lot of unfounded claims made in that statement, including the notion that he's a dictator. Now, there is a kernel of truth to what he's trying to get out here, and it has to do with the fact that Ukraine has not held presidential elections. But that is for a good reason. So let me give you some of the reporting on that. Here's what Trump is citing. This is an Associated Press headline dating back to November of 2023. It reads, Ukraine's president rules out holding elections next spring and calls for unity in fighting Russia. Now, Zelensky did in fact cancel the elections. He made that announcement in 2023, and here's what he said. Now, in wartime, when there are so many challenges, it is absolutely irresponsible to throw the topic of elections into society in a light-hearted and playful way, Zelensky said, adding that the waves of any politically divisive things must stop. He continues with, we must realize that now is the time of defense, the time of the battle that determines the fate of the state and people, not the time of manipulations, which only Russia expects from Ukraine. I believe that now is not the right time for elections. Now, look, it's also important to note that at a time of war, Ukraine is in martial law and they pause elections. And that's not based on what Zelensky has unilaterally decided. That is literally based on legislation that passed in Ukraine. And so in order for elections to be held at a time of martial law, at a time of war, they would obviously need to either repeal or amend that legislation. And by the way, I mean, you also have to keep in mind that during the war, and as we speak, Russia has taken control of about 20%, 1/5 of Ukraine's territory. And so those Ukrainians who are now living in occupied portions of Ukraine are not going to be able to participate in a democratic process as they would if they weren't dealing with this ongoing war and with an occupation. And so, look, you can have a problem with the fact that they're not holding presidential elections, but to call Zelensky a dictator, I think is a bit much, especially from a guy who certainly isn't saying that about Vladimir Putin, who's a dictator. He has literally poisoned and killed his political opponents. So again, real rich for Trump to say something like that. But the argument that you'll often hear from Trump's supporters is, pay attention to what he does, not what he says. And he's really trying to forge a peace deal here, which I will admit is a laudable goal. I don't have any problem with him attempting to pursue a peace deal. I think that's a good thing. And I also don't have a problem with Donald Trump meeting with Putin without Zelensky or opening up, diplomatic avenues in order to move toward a peace deal. But as we've reported previously, it does seem, based on what we've heard from, Donald Trump, that is pretty much willing to give everything away to Putin. We'll see what the end of the peace negotiations happen to be, but it's not really looking great for Zelensky. Now, Trump also alleged in his skewering of Zelensky that he admits that half of the money we sent him is missing. Now, that's a provocative statement to say the least, and it's not far-fetched for that to actually be true, but I wanted to look into it. Is that true? Did Zelensky really say that he doesn't know where half of the money is? Well, Trump made a similar provocative statement during his Mar-a-Lago press conference yesterday. Take a quick look at that.
I believe President Zelensky said last week that he doesn't know where half of the money is that we gave him. Well, we gave them, I believe, $350 billion, but let's say it's something less than that, but it's a lot. And we have to equalize with Europe because Europe has given us given a very much smaller percentage than that. I think Europe has given 100 billion, and we've given, let's say, 300 plus. And it's more important for them than it is for us. We have an ocean in between, and they don't. But where is all the money that's been given? Where is it going? And I've never seen an accounting of it.
Okay, so is it true that the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, claimed that he doesn't know where half of the aid the United States provided to him is? No, that's not true. It's actually not true at all. So what Donald Trump is referencing here is a statement that Zelensky made during an Associated Press interview on February 2nd. So he was speaking in Ukrainian, so the translation to English isn't going to be perfect, right? But when translated, here's what he said. When I hear that America gave Ukraine hundreds of billions of dollars, 177 billion to be more precise, as the president of a warring country, I can tell you that we received just over $75 billion. We are talking about specific things because we got it not with money, but with weapons. There is training, there is additional transport. There are not only prices for weapons, there were humanitarian programs, social, etc. $100 billion of these $177 billion were never received. When it said that Ukraine received $200 billion to support the army during the war, that is not true. I don't know where all the money is. Now, look, I'm gonna say that translated, it's a very clunky statement, and it could obviously be taken out of context to sound like he lost the money or the money was stolen, but that's not what he's referring to here. So what Zelensky is trying to say is that not all of the aid that the US provides for Ukraine goes directly to Zelensky or even under Ukrainian control. Only part of that aid goes through Ukrainian control. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, there's the military aid specifically, right? And so what Ukraine does is they take the specific money allocated for weapons and they spend 90% of it to buy American-made weapons. Honestly, this is a way of redistributing wealth from working class Americans who pay their taxes to defense contractors, which I have a huge problem with. But this is what the United States does in regard to foreign policy around the world when we provide military aid. It's really a way of allegedly helping out our allies, but also a way of enriching the corporate donors who serve as executives and shareholders and all of that for defense contractors like Raytheon, Boeing. You get the picture. But the rest of that money doesn't go straight to Ukraine. It goes toward humanitarian relief for Ukrainians, the training, US training of Ukrainian forces, the cost of sending more American troops to our European allied countries as a deterrent as this war continues. So Russia doesn't, consider or get tempted to invade another country in the middle of this war. Also, the US provides intelligence support. Now, I'm just giving you the facts of how this money is allocated, where this money goes. That doesn't necessarily mean that I'm in favor of all of the programs associated with this. And you don't have to be in favor of all the programs associated with this. But to say that there's some fraud going on here, that half of the money was stolen or lost, is just a flat out lie. And you have to call a spade a spade. You have to know what's actually happening with these resources. Now, according to the Center for Strategic International Studies, of the aid that the United States has given to Ukraine, 90% of military aid is spent in the United States. Again, this is the specific money allocated for weapons. 90% of that goes toward buying US made weapons. Of aid overall, 60% is spent in the United States. About 25% is spent in Ukraine. And the final 15% is spent globally. Now, Donald Trump is also incorrect to claim that the United States is footing a much larger portion of the bill compared to Europe. And by the way, I have made this mistake because when you look at, $200 billion being sent to, one conflict abroad, it's a lot of money. And I can understand Americans being frustrated with the fact that we just keep shelling out taxpayer resources for conflicts abroad. However, it's just not true that in this specific example, in this war between Russia and Ukraine, that the US has actually provided more aid than the EU has. So according to The Economist, which did a deep dive on this, the most authoritative numbers are compiled regularly by the Kiel Institute, a German think tank. Its latest report, published on February 14th, shows that European contributions individually from governments and collectively from European institutions outstrip America's aid. Now, one thing to know here is obviously the United States is one country. So as one country, we have provided a certain amount of aid to Ukraine during this war. Whereas the EU is a coalition of European countries. So that's how this data is being analyzed. And if you take a look at the bilateral aid commitments to Ukraine, these numbers are in euros because obviously the think tank that did it is a German think tank. And so they do their research and their analysis through euros as opposed to dollars. But as you can see from this graph, it shows you that, the United States and EU and the EU have contributed similar amounts of money in regard to military aid for weapons. However, overall, the EU has given 132 billion euros. Okay, so 132 billion euros overall in terms of money that's already been allocated, whereas the US has given 114 billion euros. Obviously, the US is still the largest single donor, but by a super wide margin, but collectively the EU has given more. But there's additional funding, right? So that's the money that's already been allocated. But there's money that has been, voted on by Congress that hasn't been dispersed yet. And so let's take a look at the next graph. And here you will see that the EU is about to essentially disperse more money while the US basically pales in comparison, and a sizable portion of the yet to be allocated EU funds will bolster Ukraine's military. So I just wanted to give you all the details on that. Now, Donald Trump also keeps harping on how aid from Europe is guaranteed. I'm sure you've heard him say that before, while the funding from the United States is not. And this is what he means. And I do think that he raises a legitimate point here. He says, or I should say, The Economist found that almost 90% of the financial aid from EU institutions has been in the form of loans, albeit with very generous terms. Roughly 60% of America's financial aid is given as grants. So grants are obviously different from loans. We're not expecting grants to be paid back by the Ukrainian government, but you get the picture. Donald Trump feels that American taxpayers are essentially getting shafted by contributing money in the form of grants, but European countries are not doing the same. And look, I think that is a legitimate point. But let me hear you make that point about the money that we give to Israel. Because I don't hear him making that point about the money we give to Israel. And we give Israel $4 billion a year by default for their, military aid and all of that. And so that's what the reality of the situation is. I don't think this looks good for Zelensky. The tit for tat, the, verbal war that he's at with Donald Trump is not going to play out well for him, considering the little leverage he has. And the fact that Donald Trump seems to be friendlier to Russia in forging ahead with peace negotiations. But it remains to be seen what the terms of that peace deal will be if that peace deal ever comes to fruition. Remember, Donald Trump forged somewhat of a diplomatic or friendly relationship with North Korea during his first term. And the idea was that they would halt their nuclear testing. They did no such thing. They continued with their nuclear testing. They continued developing nuclear weapons. Satellite evidence makes that abundantly clear. And so we'll see how this plays out. While again, I think that the criticisms toward Trump about his willingness to talk to Russia and forge those diplomatic ties without Ukraine involved at first are ridiculous. I don't think that's that big of a deal. I do think these lies about, where the money has gone and, Zelensky being a dictator is ridiculous and honestly flies in the face of wanting a peace deal. You want a peace deal, you shouldn't go around smearing and slandering someone. The one final thing I'll say is, a few years ago, there was some reporting indicating that some of the funding that the United States had provided to Ukraine had gone missing. It was about $40 million. As far as I know, that was the only reporting indicating that some of the money might have been misspent or used for matters that it was not intended. So it's not far-fetched for that to happen. I don't want to pretend like that's unheard of. But to say that half the money was stolen or Zelensky doesn't know where half the money is, again, is just not true.
If you enjoyed this video, that's because of our members. They make us independent, they make us strong, and they make us honest. Become a member today by hitting the join button below.